All right.
All right. So, you all know me. Well, you don't know me. My name is Matt. This is the PCC forum, an interdisciplinary dialogue group that my partner Beck and I have been running for about 4 years now. We've invited scholars from all over the country, and we also invite doctoral students in our own program. PCC is Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. And as you can see, it's a very interdisciplinary program. We strive to be transdisciplinary, actually, not to get stuck into specific disciplinary lenses. And tonight, we are welcoming Tam Hunt. Tam is a visiting professor at the Graduate School of Environmental Policy Management at UC Santa Barbara. He's a small business owner. He's the author of a book, Eco, Ego, and Eros, essays on philosophy, spirituality, and science, which I have read and greatly enjoyed, which was partially a collection of columns that he wrote for the Santa Barbara Examiner, which must have like 50 columns over the years. So I've been exploring Tam's work for a little more than a year now, maybe more than that. I discovered him when I was up late at night reading the atheist materialist biologist Jerry Coyne's blog, and he had a post that was called Stealth Creationist in Santa Barbara. I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. So I started reading into that, and then made my way to read some of the columns on the Santa Barbara Examiner page, and really felt that I found a kindred spirit, someone who's trying to integrate various forms of scientific knowledge with spirituality. Tam's been influenced by Alfred Whitehead, a major teacher of my own, and really, trying to carve a middle path between a scientific perspective that avoids falling into the pitfalls of materialism, and at the same time makes room for spirituality without leaving science and sort of empirical, experimental attitude that comes with the sciences behind. So I'm very excited to hear what he has to share with us about his approach to deep science. I think this is a version of the presentation that Tam will be offering later this summer at the International Whitehead Conference down in Claremont, California, which I'm going to, and all the PCC faculty are going to, so if you guys don't know about that, we can talk about it after the presentation. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to having Tam there.
Yeah.
So that said, welcome, Tam.
Well, thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
And actually on that, the story of us meeting, I wrote this column, as Matt mentioned, for a few years, and I actually forwarded that column to Jerry Coyne. It's called Natural Selection and Universal Eros. And Eros is an idea that Whitehead actually championed, that there is some kind of innate drive in all of reality to be attracted or repelled, essentially. Part of evolution itself is a function of this Eros in humanity, and at levels far below humanity. And Jerry Coyne did not respond to my email, but he did flatter me with an attack piece on his blog. That was what Matt described. It's titled "Stealth Creationist in Santa Barbara," and he kind of it was almost an ad hominem attack against my ideas, and calling me creationist is kind of silly because I said in the first paragraph, I'm not an intelligent design proponent. I'm going to come from this as a hard-nosed philosopher and scientist. So it was very kind of disingenuous to do that. I then actually tried to respond on his blog in a detailed manner. He deleted my responses. Matt, a year later, got on the same blog and responded in a very kind, diplomatic, but comprehensive way, kind of saying what I would have said if I had been allowed to keep it there, but part of a better tone. So then actually I pinged Matt and said, hey, that was really cool that you wrote that. What's your background? So we began talking there. So it was kind of a cool little online connection made there. And yeah, so thanks for having me here, Matt. And I'm going to be talking about absent-minded science, which is what I term today's mainstream science, and then a deep science approach, which I think should be tomorrow's improved science. And I'm not rejecting science at all. I am a scientist by training, a biologist by training. I'm also a lawyer, so I've been taught how to think, I hope, in a rational way through my years of training and practice. And what I see in today's science is an overly narrow view that needs to be expanded. So I'm going to talk about why that's the case.
Tam, what department did you say you were in?
I teach once a year at the Brennan School at UCSB. I'm also visiting a scholar in psychology with Jonathan Schooler, who is a good friend of Steve's here. So I have kind of many hats I wear, and I'm a lawyer by day. So in terms of transdisciplinary, I think I embody that pretty well. I also want to say, please ask questions. I'd rather a dialogue here. And do you mind if we close one of the windows, perhaps? It's a bit of background. So, perfect. So science is all about knowing, right? It's about knowledge and ultimately what is reality. And this is, what unites philosophy and science, and also spirituality. What is reality? What's our place in it? Are we a kitten or are we a lion? So how do you actually figure out the answers? That's what science is primarily. And we have fallen into this temporary mode of pretending there is no subject in our science today. This is a quote from Erwin Schrödinger, a physicist who was very key in developing quantum mechanics. I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's fairly long, but the idea is that he's saying by the principle of objectivation, we step back from the world, pretend we're not there, to examine it objectively, and we forget we do that. And so my point in this whole discussion is to, take this cue and say, maybe it's time to reinsert ourselves back into reality scientifically, acknowledge we are in reality in everything we do, and then develop a new, deeper science because of that repositioning of ourselves metaphorically. So is today's science adequate? I mean, sure, a lot of people will say it is. And we had a discussion here a couple nights ago about this upcoming Claremont conference about modern science and, what should we do? Is it fine as is? And, a lot of folks I rub elbows with say it's fine. Look, we have a lot of answers. We don't have everything, of course, figured out, but we're getting there. What's wrong with the reductionist, materialist worldview? And I'm going to explore what I think is wrong with it here. But I want to acknowledge that a lot of people say yes, and a lot of the intelligentsia today would say yes, it's fine. It's a work in progress, of course. It's what science is. It's all about being a work in progress. But ultimately, the methodology is not flawed. It's actually quite good. It's gotten us here with cell phones and satellites and all this cool stuff, Others say no, because science, of course, leaves spirituality kind of problematic. If you are a hard-nosed scientist, quote unquote, you've got a pretty depressing worldview, frankly. There's not a whole lot of meaning in a traditional sense to keep you going. You need to look elsewhere for that kind of meaning, which you can do. You don't have to be a scientist and be an atheist, but typically people are. So I need to change this real quick. Why did that go dead on me? Okay, well, I always have to touch it occasionally, make it not do that. And then last, there's a growing discussion about the hard problem of consciousness, the mind-body problem, and how maybe modern science is lacking because it seems to have no good answer for the hard problem.
Could you describe that again?
I'm going to talk about it quite a bit, actually, so I'm going to introduce it there. So I define absent-minded science as the tendency through intention or oversight to ignore mind and nature. And this is today's science for the most part. So again, it's not unitary. Some sciences, of course, look at mind explicitly, psychology, but there has been various phases in psychology where it went from originally being introspective by nature, William James, etc., to then becoming very objective, Watson, and of course Skinner, the behavior school, and now it's kind of relaxing a bit again, but it's still there. I call it the behaviorist hangover. In biology, it certainly is very bad form to talk about mind or intention and purpose in evolution, and not just from the point of view of a deity or an intelligent designer, but even from the point of view of the organism itself. No, this is random evolution. In physics, it's a bit less clear because there was quite a bit of discussion about the role of mind in quantum mechanics back in the early part of the last century, and that's been taken up by various folks in the last 100 years to suggest maybe we actually create our realities actively through classes of the wave function, etc. But the mainstream view is still not that there is an active role for mind in creating reality in the mainstream physics community. But it's complicated, I accept that. And I already mentioned the psychology piece. On the mind-body problem, the basic problem is that today's science says simply that there is no mind until a certain point in biology, and then poof, mind appears. So a great quote from a biologist says, "Emergence of the mind from no mind is sheer magic." And that to me is dissatisfying. And of course, today, like Dawkins or Dennett would not agree with this, but that's really their position. It is. It's saying, look, we don't know where it appears exactly, but at some point in the phylogenetic tree, mind suddenly appears. And no one knows why, or why it's that moment, or why it's not the prior moment, etc. So it really is problematic. Alan Watts, as I was saying to Steve before we began today, who was the dean here for 5 years, you knew that, right? Has a great quote. Says, the most profound metaphysical principle is that for every inside there is an outside, and every outside there is an inside. And though they're different, they go together. And I read Alan Watts' original when I was like 20, I think, and it really inspired me. And I might have read his quote even back then. It might have been the first kind of clue I had that this was a better solution to the mind-body problem than the prevailing views. Now, this view is shorthand known today as panpsychism or pan-experientialism. And the view is that really mind is pervasive. Where there's matter, there's mind, and vice versa. And it simply complexifies as matter complexifies. And it gets no respect for a long time until fairly recently, a few years ago. It really began getting more attention. And this guy was a big part of it. He actually wrote an article in Scientific American a year and a half ago now, called "Is Consciousness Universal?" And he said, as a natural scientist, I find a version of panpsychism modified for the 21st century to be the single most elegant and parsimonious explanation for the universe I found myself in. And he quotes Alan Watts, that exact same quote, in the beginning of his article. He also wrote the foreword for my book. And I'm pretty sure he got the book from me. So this guy is big time. He was a Caltech for 25 years in biophysics. He wrote the Bible in neuroscience. And he went 2 years ago to an institute in Seattle called the Allen Center for the Study of Brain Science, I believe it is. He's their chief scientific officer there. So him coming out as a panpsychist was a big shift in the debate. And it's kind of reverberating now in the community. So I don't want to make too much of it, but it was a big deal.
What's his first name?
Christoph Koch.
That's
Cool guy, German. So I'm going to talk about deep science as an antidote to this tendency toward absent-minded science. And again, please ask questions as we go, if you have questions. Deep science is a phrase from Ken Wilber. I think he used it originally in a book called The Marriage of Sense and Soul. And by that phrase, he means science and spirituality. And it's a really good book. It's really short. And Ken has, for many years now, developed what he calls the 4 quadrants model, or AQUAL. I think all quadrants, all levels is a term he uses nowadays. And the idea is, pursuant to this idea of deep science and panpsychism, that science has focused for a long time now on this half of reality, the objective half, the it and the its, objective, interobjective. We now need to focus as well on the other half, I and we, subjective, intersubjective. So reality has been dichotomized in a way that was then forgotten. And of course, in reality, quote unquote, in practical reality, we never forgot that. We all knew we were here. But in scientific terms, you can see it in the language that's been used for a long time. It's still used. It is found. It was concluded. There was an attempt to pull the subject, the scientist herself, out of that process. And of course, that's a fiction, because it's very much a scientist there doing that. So Wilbur talks about three basic components. He calls it kind of the triple braid to deep science. And the key point here is that these three steps, the injunction, meaning the set of instructions as to how to test nature, and then the apprehension, the collection of data, and then the confirmation or rejection, also known as falsification. These three strands should be applied to all four quadrants. And that's really, there we go.
I don't think it's timing out. I think it's some other issue.
Is it loose?
So Wilbur's point is that we need to apply those three strands to every quadrant to be truly scientific and to expand upon the overly shallow, the world services approach that modern science has taken. Now, with that little introduction, I want to kind of add on maybe some extra pieces of my own to the deep science term. Go ahead, Steve.
Back up one slide. I mean, how much of this problem do you think is caused by the way universities are organized? So I look at the upper left quadrant, that's psychology, and down in the bottom left, anthropologists are talking about this stuff. And then you have psychologists who are interested in situated or distributed, people like Ed Hutchins at UCSD that like to, like to put them all together. I mean, how much of this comes from the fact that we organize our universities around departments?
It's a big part of it, yeah. I mean, to be an academic today, you have to specialize in a very, very narrow way, not just like in one field, but a sub niche of that field typically. So being a generalist is not encouraged. I'm lucky, I get to be a generalist because my day job is not in this field. I'm a lawyer, so I can afford to be a generalist. That's unusual.
In the 1990s, we started seeing multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary programs, and they seem like they're more. But even today, looking for looking at the job calls, there is psych, and you need to fit in with everybody. You have to have support for your work, your ideas, and department. Like maybe our organizations are causing this.
I think you're very right, and Matt, when I ask you guys, PCC and CIS, I mean, you are part of the antidote, right? Because your approach is along these lines and has been from day one. So schools like this, which are not in mainstream currently, are working to change that mainstream to become the mainstream in the future.
Yeah, and a lot of the influences on shaping, in particular, our program, PCC, is like Thomas Berry talks about the university is supposed to be organized like the universe.
Yeah.
Like as a microcosm of that macrocosm, and the universe isn't broken up into these departmental, sections.
Use of that word, universe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Same great.
College.
Okay, so looking a bit deeper into kind of the really nitty-gritty, what do we know? And I have the what do we really know here. I would say just a few things. This is my list. I'm curious what your list is. There is experience here now. And this is my paraphrase or shift from Descartes and his I think, therefore I am. I think that's going too far, personally. Because to say there's an I has a lot of baggage to it. What is that I? What we know for sure is there's experience here, now, and something's going on. That's what I mean by experience. The contents of my experience and my consciousness change constantly. And that's what I call the flow of time. That's the passage of time. So time in that manner is very real to me. It seems as real as anything that I know. And I also seem to have freedom in my actions. And this one I would certainly acknowledge is debatable, because I think even if we are a libertarian in the free will debate sense, I'm not entirely free, of course. I can't defy gravity by jumping or how I want to. A lot of things you can't do. But I feel like a lot of things I can do. I can choose to step here, choose to raise my arm, etc. But that, of course, is a big debate in psychology and philosophy today. Are you free to do anything? Is everything determined?
Physics.
In physics,
Physics.
definitely. Yeah.
No.
So I would put an asterisk here. I think that's pretty clear that I seem to be free. But the first two, I'd say for sure. You know, no one could convince me otherwise. So my point here is that any physical theory that tries to contradict these 2 or 3 axioms should be viewed with real suspicion. And the problem in today's science is that a lot of theories do in fact try to contradict these basic axioms of our experience as human beings, and yet they are embraced by a lot of people, strangely.
Can you give an example of a theory that would
Yeah.
contradict that?
I'll show you right now. Grammatica says, what doesn't kill you will hopefully try again, if you are an eliminativist. So this term has been used by a few folks, and there's very few who would admit to being eliminativists. But one of them is Michael Graziano at Princeton, and he's written a few things in the last couple of years. This is the New York Times as an op-ed. He says, there is no subjective impression, meaning there's no feeling of me here and now. There is only information in a data processing device. How does the brain go beyond processing information to become subjectively aware of information? The answer is it doesn't. So this guy is an extreme position for sure. But people like him and Daniel Dennett have said this kind of stuff for years now. And to me, it seems insane. Like, how can you really believe that? But he's saying, this is what I believe, and he's urging others to follow. So this is an extreme example, but again, it's kind of like it typifies what the debate is about. You know, I'm curious what you guys think of those quotes. I mean, does that make any sense to you?
Actually, no, it doesn't.
He's saying that feelings are just more information that's being cranked out of this computer that is our mind.
Right.
Today is April 17th, and love is no different than that. It's another
Well, he's not further than that.
more data.
He's not saying like we can frame all those feelings in information processing terms. He's saying there's nothing but information processing.
Yeah, it's just data.
He's saying that feeling you think you have, you don't have that feeling.
It's data. It's just data.
But
it's like
I'm like, you can't tell me what feeling I do or don't have. I can tell you right now, I have this feeling. And he's like, no, you don't.
No, your feeling about your feeling is just more data.
It's just an illusion, that feeling you think you have. You know? So
It's very strange. It almost ends up sounding like some kind of Zen con, where they're trying to get us to like wake up to this mystical truth that we have no self, and there's nobody
maybe
home.
you're right. Yeah, I mean,
But
they're
that
not
but
bad
that doesn't
people.
seem. Yeah, but it's like there's another approach that would be slightly less extreme, which is like consciousness is an epiphenomenal emergent thing
Yeah.
that has no effect on. We don't have free will, so anything I think or feel is not going to change how my body ends up behaving.
Exactly.
But this is even more extreme. This is
Yeah.
saying I'm not even feeling anything. That
Yeah.
when we talk about all these subjective, qualitative experiences, they're just words,
Mhm.
and we talk ourselves into thinking that we're having experiences. When
He's saying we're basically zombies. And
Yeah.
there's a long debate
It's
about
very strange.
zombies. Do we have zombies that look like us and act like us but aren't really conscious? He's saying we're all zombies.
Yeah.
We just think we are conscious.
Yeah.
And does that make sense to you now?
Well, I mean, it sounds like it's an aesthetic question, like he likes certain language, but he doesn't like other language. And so for me, like, subjective impression, like he's saying, no, that doesn't exist, but data processing, processing information, that is what's happening. And for me, I don't see the difference almost. I mean, it seems to me at least that yes, I'm processing data, and that process, I sort of has these phenomena that I would call feelings, you know, to go along with them. But it seems like he's just kind of trying to use objective language as opposed to like terms that you can't really use scientific language for, like feelings you can't.
Yeah, I've not talked to him personally, so I don't know entirely where he's coming from, but I've read an article by him as well as this, you know, short piece in the New York Times. And I mean, this second vote to me shows he's going further than you're suggesting.
Yeah, I don't
You know,
get that, because there's no like,
it doesn't.
what is it doing
It
that?
doesn't become subjectively aware. So he's saying awareness itself is an illusion.
But how would he make that
He argues that
claim if he's
awareness
not being aware?
is a translation of attention. So the
Attention?
brain has attention processing modules, and these have evolved in a certain way because we have 4 billion years of history behind us to make us who we are today.
Okay.
And those attention modules become awareness in our conscious minds in a way that give us information about what's going on below that conscious level. But then he goes way further and says, but that awareness you think you have as a different feeling is entirely an illusion. So maybe he's being provocative and willing to be, quote unquote, the bad guy, saying, no, you're not really aware. But what he's writing, taken literally, and not like, you know, trying to be convoluted about it, he's saying there is no subjective awareness, which means it's crazy. So again, either he's being provocative or he's crazy.
Well, it also kind of seems like as a scientist or somebody who's trying to be a scientist, his value set would be such that you can't know that you know feeling exists. All you can know is a sort of thing that is. I mean, maybe it's epiphenomena. I don't get it, but you know, in the interest of learning more about this thing, I'll be quiet.
Oh, it's all good, please. Yeah, we got time to have a discussion here. So I mean, I'll reframe this again. Why I raise this here is because we're talking about the hard problem, the mind-body problem, in today's mainstream science and in a deep science, which I'm advocating we should be going toward. Again, this is not a typical position. I'd say this is like, you know, held by about 2 people in the world right now, like Dena and Graziano. But it is typical of some of the kind of posturing we see in today's mainstream community when talking about consciousness, because it has a taboo, a stigma of woo. Talking about our minds is woo for a lot of people. And again, to me, that's kind of crazy because our minds are primary.
Sure.
We are nothing but our minds, ultimately.
By the way, what's your definition of woo?
New agey, fuzzy, you know, woo-woo thinking.
Okay.
Yeah.
To defend him from one moment, for no reason at all. But I almost don't see the difference between him saying that consciousness doesn't exist and you saying that the first. Can you back up a slide? Like Descartes, like the I doesn't exist.
You don't see that difference between that?
Yeah, because
and
it
the other?
seems like it's both a subjective experience that he's denying.
Well, I would distinguish the two between saying my position that when I think about what I really know, being very, very, you know, just the facts man, I know that there's experience here right now. And I could be a brain in a vat. I could be in a simulation. We can't deny these, you know, we can't. I don't think we are, but we can't deny it. But what I do know, no matter what I am, is that there's experience here now. And that's why I say Descartes went a bit too far in saying there is, you know, an I am. Now, unless you say I is what experience is, that's fine. But then for Graziano to go further and say there is no subjective awareness at all, is, I think, quite different than what I'm saying.
Or at least that's an illusion.
Well, he's saying there isn't. Well, I mean, maybe he's saying 2 things. He's saying maybe both. You know, he's saying it doesn't, you know, first of all. Then he says, well, here's what I mean by that. Is that feeling of awareness you have, that's an illusion based on lower level processing you're not aware of that is translated to your mind, and you call that subjective awareness.
Right,
You know?
and the fact that he's calling it an illusion, whereas you're calling, or not you, but like we were calling it a reality, seems to be simply a matter of like what language you like better to.
It might be a
talk about
bit,
the same.
yeah, it may be, and but I think language is important too. You know, so in terms of the general discussion here about deep science and absent-minded science,
Mhm.
my general point is that we need to acknowledge mind far more in our science than we have to date. He would probably say the opposite. So that's a big difference there in terms of the actual
Yeah.
conclusions.
Well, fuck that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Gotta prove him wrong now. He's just gonna say what you're feeling is just really good data.
Exactly.
Really good data. There's a Shakespearean sonnet and there's the words to a Nickelback song. You know, it's just really good stuff.
Yeah.
That's what he's saying.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to actually talk to him because I used him primarily as kind of a bête noire there, you know. But I am curious now to kind of, you know, learn more about his positions. But I've been talking to Dennett for years now, and Dennett actually is, I think, hopelessly, you know, conflicted. He's, I think, trying to be provocative, trying to be an entertainer, trying to be rigorous, but not making sense, frankly. And he's a great guy, but his work in philosophy, I think, is really bad. It just doesn't make sense, you know. I guess from like a purely rational, logical point of view. Any more on this? Okay. So, continuing on the theme of deep science and how we should kind of be modifying our approach to knowledge. Another key point is that when you are confronting the world that we're given, you know, you wake up, quote unquote, as a baby, and you're just like, I'm hungry, I'm tired, you know, whatever you're doing. When you become a human, as you age and acquire a mind and some history, you then kind of reconsider, what is this? But you're in the middle of it. You're always given the world. So that given world is entirely in your mind from 2 points of view. One, that you close your eyes and you go to sleep and the world goes away, you go away. And then two, we know from looking at other human beings who have eyes and bodies and heads and brains and minds, and we know some history about how we got here. We know that everything we perceive from a data point of view is from our senses, and it's reconstructed in our minds to give us a world. So mind is still very primary. We don't know a thing about the world directly. It's all indirect. So you have to, if you're being careful as a scientist, recognize it is all in your mind, ultimately. Now, there's a very key corollary there. I'm not saying the world does not exist. I feel pretty strongly it does exist. You know, I'm not an idealist in that sense. I'm a realist, a scientific realist. But I recognize epistemologically, I know nothing of the world directly. I only know it indirectly. I infer everything about the world other than those 2 or 3 axioms I mentioned a while ago. And that's a really key point, to be careful about knowledge. You need to kind of recognize that really limited base you have to begin your inquiry about what the world is and where you are in that world. Now, if you recognize that, even if you don't buy it, just bear it, you know, go along with me here for a second. If you recognize that, and you know what I mean, you also need to recognize that the boundary between my body and me and the world is entirely arbitrary. Entirely arbitrary. Because my body is just another set of data in that reconstruction of the world. And the boundary seems fairly clear, but again, it's not at all primary, and it's not at all beyond doubt. So when you recognize that, the deep science that I'm advocating allows you to approach the world, meaning that entire field of consciousness, from a unified set of principles and tools. And this goes back to the, you know, Campbell's 3 strands of knowledge. You can use those same tools to probe your inner mind and the outer world. And you should, because all of it is ultimately a continuum of experience. It's all one thing.
Well, this leaves you with all quantum mechanics, looks like. You know, bring up the quantum eraser experiment, you know, that one, where, you know, the wave particle, you see the waveform. If you attempt to capture what actually happened to a particle and you measure it, boop, it changes. If you throw away the information, it changes back. I mean, it just seems like, you know, the Copenhagen interpretation of the quantum mechanics experiments is that understand there is no reality until you look at it.
That's a deep debate, and I don't want to go down that road too far tonight, but I'll just add this kind of quick comment, is that I think, yes, we are certainly co-creators of our reality, but not in the way that Copenhagen suggests. I think there's a real problem in Copenhagen in the collapse of the wave function. Well, here's why. Because if you choose that interpretation, how did this whole thing evolve? We are, new minds in this universe. We know from the fossil record. So how did the universe collapse into something definite to allow that process to evolve? So you had some wave collapsing process from the get-go. And my preferred interpretation is kind of a Whiteheadian ongoing self-collapse model, where every entity from the electron up is self-collapsing in each moment. So it's still a collapse, but it's an ongoing process.
Well, it gets near stuff and gets observed in a seemingly random fashion. What we get is what we get. The world just takes a stand, and this is the outcome of all that.
Yeah, it's a participatory process, right, where everything is taking part in that process. And so it's not just humans kind of torturing electrons into revealing their true nature, as a way of a particle. It's everything constantly probing everything else as to what are you, what are you doing in this moment. That's what I mean by kind of ongoing co-creation and self-collapse. But I don't want to down the road too far.
We'll talk about quantum computers.
Yeah, that's a different lecture. Oh man.
You're going to go into what you mean by self-collapse, right?
Self-collapse.
Yes.
Just one more thing on it, because again, that's not my talk tonight. Self-collapse refers to, this is kind of my little gloss on Whitehead's physics, okay? So it's not anything that Whitehead wrote about, it's kind of my extension of his thinking into physics, is that if you take the panpsychist worldview seriously, where everything from the photon and electron up has some kind of mind, the role of that mind is to make choices. And collapse is about choice, right? So collapse is about where do you manifest in the next moment. So the ongoing self-collapse is literally a process in every moment for every entity in the universe.
Okay.
So it's not about wave particle in this indefinite stew of possibility. It's about actual entities in an infinite ocean of possibility that self-collapse at each moment. Is that all clear?
Make a choice in a way.
Yeah.
There's something about their awareness, even at that level.
There's a great quote from Freeman Dyson, an American physicist, about the process of choice we see in humans is the same in electrons to a lesser degree. I'm paraphrasing, So we talk about chance events in quantum physics experiments. He says it's not chance, it's choice. So this is an attempt to express what I was talking about earlier visually. This is experience as it arises in our minds. If you're sitting in meditation or doing whatever you're doing at any moment, this is at least how I experience it. Things just pop up here and there in my field of consciousness. And there's no any ordering intrinsically. My headache, maybe here, the world is out there somewhere, my body's in some relation to my headache. It's kind of like here and here kind of thing. And then my experience in general is this large field. But then, as we grow, as a toddler or a baby on, we learn how to order those experiences to make sense of the world. We infer space, we infer distance, we infer the relationship of our body in relation to everything else. So things are reordered in a way that the world in here, is in the middle. Everything else in the world out there is outside. The starry night's over here. My body is kind of overlapping because it's both in here, quote unquote, and out there too. My headache is overlapping too. So that makes sense? I mean, I know it's kind of a weird perspective, but to me, again, it feels that that's how things happen.
So what you think of the starry night can be affected by your headache, certainly.
Yeah. And in the first, just to paraphrase again, my headache and the starry night are kind of co-equal in terms of their reality to me. And in fact, my headache is a lot more real than my starry night vision looking out there. But they're always kind of just things in my consciousness, right? Just experiences, feelings, ultimately.
And then we just sort of give our attention to different ones.
Yeah, yeah.
So, okay, so the world out there is contained in the field of experience. That's what this is saying. Like basically, I mean, because I was wondering in the one before, basically what the sort of boundary of that field of experience is. And I kind of like this one because it seems like that field of experience does not have a boundary. Is that what is going on here?
I'm not suggesting there's a real boundary here. It's just visually I have to have a boundary.
Mm-hmm.
God, irritating.
But I guess I was wondering when you like the field of experience in the first one, are you referring to the purple circle in that one, and is this one the white background? Or is this one also the
The
purple?
field of experience is the largest circle in each one.
Gotcha.
So I had to put the title outside for this one to kind of show this is the world out there,
Right.
and here, but it's still just our unified field of experience.
Gotcha.
Yeah. It would seem, from a cosmological perspective, especially if we adopt Whitehead's cosmology, that field of experience would extend as far as light has reached us in the cosmic background. Like, so
Yeah.
that is the wider field, and when we experience the light, we're participating in the experience of those photons that have traveled to us. That becomes part of our field of experience.
Definitely.
And this first circle, reminds me of James's famous comment about the experience of infants as a blooming, buzzing confusion, where that sense of inside and outside hasn't been clearly differentiated yet. But moving to the next slide, where you see that this is a more adult form of consciousness, where we've internalized that basically culturally determined sense of what's mine and what's not mine. We've been potty trained. We know that waste is no longer mine. And we gain more of a sense of an ability to differentiate between ourselves and others.
Yeah.
That has to be learned for the most part.
I think it's definitely cultural. I think a lot of it is also transcultural, in that it's kind of evolutionary to function in the world, again, because we have 4 billion years of survival. That's a primary imperative, right? That has allowed us to navigate the world.
Yeah.
This model making ahead is all about navigating the world.
Yeah, it's a nature-nurture thing, somewhere in between, but, like different cultures, like more communitarian, collectivist cultures will have a wider sense of, or maybe a narrow sense of what's mine versus what's yours.
Sure.
Whereas here in America,
Larger sense of self, perhaps.
Yeah. Whereas in an individualistic culture, it's that boundary is sharper, and I have my property, you have your property.
Yeah. Sure. So these ideas are being translated to the mainstream slowly but surely. And this is my colleague, Jonathan Schooler, our mutual friend, how we met. And he's a professor of psychology at PCC and has a new paper out called Bridging the Objective/Subjective Divide. And it's all about how we can kind of arrive at a meta perspective to combine the traditional third-person perspective of objective science with a new, more rigorous first-person science in psychology initially, because he is in psychology. And his idea is to recognize that both are valid ways of knowing, and to combine the two by just saying, look, there are different ways of knowing. Just like a Necker cube, kind of the skeleton of the cube you look at can be a box you're looking into, or a box you're looking at from the outside, and it's entirely up to you as to how you perceive it. He's saying reality is kind of like that. And first person, third person is very much in the same manner. It's a question of what you choose to perceive in that moment. And if you're a scientist, you can choose both techniques to get a more complete view of the world. And I think this view is entirely consonant with Wilber's approach of recognizing that all things have an inside, some manner. I mean, it's not quite as philosophical as Wilber's approach, but Schooler is actually also a self-professed panpsychist at times. He changes week to week, but usually he's panpsychist. So he is part of this kind of ongoing discussion. He knows Christoph Koch pretty well too.
Where's that paper?
It's actually linked to right here, so I can see
Just
this
click it.
presentation.
Yeah, I understand where it is.
What's that?
You know understand where the paper is?
Oh, in the process, you mean?
Yeah.
It's published.
Yeah.
It's part of a book.
Bullet journal.
Part of the book.
Yeah, it's part of
What's
a
it,
book,
what's
yeah.
it called?
Yeah.
The book, I don't know what it's called, but the paper is called Bridging the Objective / Subject Divide. And you can, I can send you the paper if you like, it's in PDF.
Cool, yeah,
I don't think I have it.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I wonder if that would be the only way you could solve the hard problem of consciousness.
By recognizing both perspectives.
I mean, by recognizing that, like, as soon as you are, you know, trying to do science, you're engaged in a phenomenological process, which itself seems to really, I mean, take for granted that you have a subjective role in this supposedly objective science.
Yeah, no, it's a big step. And even when he says, look, we got to recognize to improve today's approach that there is a valid first-person perspective, we can get good data and assign this from that perspective alongside the more traditional third-person objective approaches. He says, because I added this as a comment in his paper, he says even that pretend third-person objective approach is a pretend approach because you're still first person as a scientist, right? You always are first person. So it's just always a trick that you say, I'm being objective. You're never not there. You're
Really?
always there, you know? So it's kind of silly in a way, right? You're like, I think I'm not here, but I'm really here, you know?
Well, and, I mean, yeah, like that seems to be the problem we're dealing with, right? Like, the fact that science is supposedly objective, and yet it's used to do so much, like, damage and, you know, exploitate, like, reinforcing certain relationships that are based on the denial of a very simple truth, you know? Anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, yeah, it's all part of the same discussion, for sure.
I'm thinking of a form of very early phenomenology that came out of William James's work, he was, I guess, working at the same time as Husserl, who kind of developed phenomenology independently in Europe. But for James, he would describe the stream of consciousness as involving this sort of I, me loop, where the I would, this is all subjective now, but it's like there's a subjective subject, the I, and then there's a subjective object, the me. I refer to myself as an object within my own consciousness.
Yeah, you're in your own model, right? Yeah.
I observe myself, and so internally I become an object to myself. And, you know, adopting your perspective here that consciousness is primary, there's a way in which objectivity can be reestablished just with that primacy of consciousness in the background, where we're dealing with a kind of subjective objectivity.
Yeah.
We're observing ourselves in that stream of consciousness.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Hofstadter has a book called I Am a Strange Loop.
Yeah.
Do you know what that is? Yes. He's actually a Harvard materialist, but his idea about the hard problem is that we are essentially a strange loop of kind of infinite recursion in that process you're talking about.
Right.
It kind of reifies itself through that kind of mirror effect. But I like your framing. That's a good way of putting it, where you can recognize that it is all ultimately subjective, but we are our own objects in that manner. I'll go one step further too and say, even though when I say experience is primary, again, I'm not denying the world. I recognize we have some very interesting data showing we've been here about 4 billion years on this planet, and the universe is probably 14 billion years or so old currently. So there's a history there, and we came out of that. So there's a universe, but for us as conscious beings, we have to recognize that our knowing the world around us is entirely inferred, and all we know directly is our own experience.
We tend to polish, in ourselves in our own model, we tend to polish that as much as we can to ensure our own survival, sometimes so that it's, you know, very different than what other people see, you know, the ego.
Yeah, like that kitty and lion thing in the front, right? I mean, it's really, you know, we are, you know, trying to make ourselves look like lions all the time, right?
Right, yeah.
Is that what you're talking about? Like kind of that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it can get pretty out of whack with reality.
Sometimes, yeah.
Well, I don't want to say reality, the perception of others.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it gets very recursive. you know, and even talking about it's kind of hard because it's, you know, you're kind of challenging a lot of the ideas that we've taken for granted by being socialized, right? And especially in science, you get socialized in any other discipline, so you kind of have to go back to being a little kid again and kind of think what's really going on, you know?
You have to have that kitty in a hall of mirrors in order to get Hofstadter's thing.
Yes.
That's just one reflection.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now this kitty is here illustrating the ability to perceive reality independently of our senses, and this term is interoception. And I raise it here as a question because I don't know personally. I don't have a view on this right now. I'm open to it, but the idea is that we have an eye of spirit, and Wilbur uses that phrase, eye of spirit, as another way of gathering knowledge about the world. So we have, you know, our regular eyes, we have an eye of mind, of contemplation, where we can deduce things. Those are uncontroversial. But the eye of spirit is controversial because it refers to a way of receiving knowledge about reality in some other manner. And a lot of mystics, of course, you know, relied on this for many, many years. And I've been experiencing myself where I certainly feel like I've gotten those kind of, you know, data streams, if you will. But you can always interpret it in a way that says, that's just my mind speaking to me, my unconscious speaking to me. It was some really good pot I had that night. Who knows what it was? But, you know, you certainly shouldn't dismiss the message of mystics who have said for millennia that they have experienced these states of consciousness where they receive information about a deeper reality that is independent of our senses. So I raise it as an interesting addition, where Wilbur says for deep science to be truly deep, it needs to include this way of knowing. And I would say we could still be deeper and still say, I'm not sure I buy this stuff yet. This is kind of woo to me. But we could be deeper than today's science by recognizing that there is mind in nature more generally and is important in our explanations.
So that eye of spirit seems to be like part of the language that's being created in this science that bridges the subject-object divide. So presumably we would need to like really understand that eye of spirit, right? Etc. So I'm just curious if you would recommend like anyone who has done substantial work on the eye of spirit, if you have any suggestions.
In terms of written work, or just
Yeah,
anyone to
or
talk to
I mean,
about it?
because I mean, yeah, I guess I'm wondering like more about this eye of spirit because it seems like there is a kind of unity of, I mean, that is, when I hear spirit, I hear woo, and I'm not dismissing woo or spirit as a critical to our existence, but I'm, I guess, like searching for like an expansion of definition on that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it seems to me that eye of spirit sort of would transcend all those other senses, but it is itself another sense almost. You know?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is very debatable, and I'd say for more on that point, definitely read Wilbur's book, The Marriage of Sense and Soul. He talks about it quite in depth. Also check out Alan Wallace's book, Hidden Dimensions, and he's a Buddhist, also trained in Western science, and he's been advocating for a long time taking Buddhism seriously as a science of the mind.
And what was it called again?
Hidden Dimensions, as a way to really probe our own minds in a way that can be looked at almost objectively like today's science, because his view is that they've done so much research through contemplation where they say, do this, and you'll see that, you'll feel that, and then you do this for a while, and you see that and that, and you can do it yourself and verify that. Now, I'm not a practicing meditator myself. I've done a little bit of meditation, but not the years that he's done, so I cannot confirm his views, but it's certainly interesting to look at.
Yeah. It's a great picture.
What's that?
Great picture.
Thank you. So the bottom line here in the deep science set of issues, just kind of make this clear in your own minds, is that our field of consciousness is unitary. There is this one field of awareness, experience of consciousness, and we reorder this based on our evolution, based on our socialization, based on our perspective more generally. And deep science is all about developing a unified set of tools and techniques to examine that single field of experience. Now I'm going to illustrate how you might get a different conclusion in today's science by looking at the discussion in physics and philosophy about the nature of time. So I'm applying now these tools in one area. So what is time? It's a huge debate in itself, but for today, time is simply change, the passage of nows, T in physics theories, all these things are time. But the nature of time is central to various problems in physics, philosophy, spirituality, etc.
People can't fit it into the models.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to exist.
Exactly, that's a big problem. So in physics, which I'm going to focus on here, you have kind of two main problems. One is explaining the experience of time psychologically in a universe that is allegedly a block universe, meaning it's four-dimensional, and the past, and present, and future all coexist in some manner in that block. It's fully determined. Change doesn't really happen. And yet we feel in our own lives that change is pervasive. Like I said in the beginning, for me, change is as real as anything I know. So when you tell me as a physicist, no, that's an illusion, I'm like, you're kind of full of crap. That's my first response, because I know change is very much real. Everything I do involves change.
But is it real?
Is it real? Yeah.
The second problem is the arrow of time, looking at why there is, in fact, an arrow of time where entropy is increasing over time, the universe is winding down, allegedly. That's a whole different set of issues. I don't agree with the framing generally, but I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm going to talk about this one. Now, again, I might be being unfair by citing someone who is, I think, maybe a bit extreme, but Hugh Price is a British philosopher who wrote a book about 20 years ago called Time's Arrow and Archimedes' Point. And he is a great writer, great thinker, and he tries to expand this idea of the view from nowhere, which has become fairly common, again, the objective viewpoint, where you kind of pretend you're the God's eye view, to the view from no when, where if you take the 4D universe seriously, you should be able to describe reality in a way that doesn't rely upon any particular perspective of time. You can be anywhere in that 4D block. So for him, time is symmetrical as space is symmetrical. And by symmetry, I mean I can walk this way, and I can walk this way back to where I was. And you can transform those motions in different ways without changing them in any way. They are all symmetrical because they are transformable without being changed. Time, for us, seems to be asymmetrical because I cannot go backwards in time. I'm always going forwards in time. But in physics, the conundrum here is, again, that we have this idea of a block universe where time is an illusion, and in fact, the past, present, and future are all co-equal. So my apparent moving forward in time can be undone in physics, in theory, because the t value in physics can be positive or negative. It's as simple as that. But the problem arises again because for us in our experience, time is entirely asymmetrical. A big part of this view as to why modern physics today says time is an illusion and that time is symmetrical is special relativity. And this is a great book, by the way, explaining the history here. Einstein's Clocks, Poincaré's Maps by Peter Galison at Harvard. And Einstein developed his theory in 1905 originally, and he concluded, based on the development of his theory over the years, that time was an illusion. You probably heard this quote before. The distinction between past, present, and future is a stubbornly persistent illusion. So again, that's the block universe idea, okay? That past, present, and future are all these kind of co-equal. They're all there, and we happen to live in the present, but we are suffering some kind of illusion. I guess the term's used a lot here.
We're enjoying.
Or enjoying it, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
really.
and the interesting history here is that this is actually a letter to his best friend's widow after he had died, the friend had died, consoling her by saying, for us believing physicists, time is in fact an illusion. So he went before me, but you know, it's not that different because, you know, it's all the same thing essentially. So, without getting too deep into this, I mean, my feeling is that this view, which is so prevalent today, is kind of a romantic way of looking at the world, where past moments are still here, and the future is accessible in some manner, where things aren't lost, it's always there. Even though it's a nice idea in some ways, the downside is that it denies freedom, because the future is determined, which means that, again, our feeling of being free beings is an illusion. Our feeling of being in a passage of time is an illusion. So if you're being empirical, this view is just really problematic. And to get to this view, Einstein was in fact trying to solve a couple different problems. He was trying to put electrodynamics on the same footing as mechanics. Without getting too deep into this, there's been relativity theory around for a long time, since Galileo and Newton. It's called Galilean relativity. And the point is that in mechanics, of course, you can describe any given system mechanically from whatever perspective you want, on a moving ship, on land, and it's all about translating between those different frames of reference. And no one is more valid than another. You just need to translate them appropriately mathematically. It's very simple in Galilean relativity. You just have to change the x value. To do it in electrodynamics, for electricity and magnetism, is very much more difficult. And Einstein's solution was to use the Lorentz transformations, which basically mess with time to allow you to transform these different frames of reference in a way that is symmetrical. And the problem with doing that, or it's a beautiful solution to a lot of people, I mean, it's a problem, is that when you mess with time, then you get to the block universe. So this is the t value in the Lorentz transformations. And the reason, you probably all know this, that when you go very fast in relativity theory, time slows down for you in relation to, you say, your peer, your brother back on planet Earth. The faster you go, the more time slows down. It's called time dilation. This happens purely because there is this equation in special relativity that has this value, it's called the gamma value, square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared, v being velocity and c being speed of light. That the closer you go to the speed of light, the more time slows down. And that's really, you know, that's the bottom line for relativity theory and special relativity. General relativity is different, but in this theory, this is what it's about. And this comes about because of an assumption about the nature of time and how it's defined operationally, and how simultaneity is defined operationally, meaning how do I know something happening here is happening at the same time, quote unquote, a mile away. And Einstein said, look, we don't need to debate about what these terms really mean. I'm going to define them operationally so I can actually get an answer. And that's a fair point of view. But the problem, again, is that when you go down that road, you get to time being an illusion, free will being an illusion. So to be empirical, you need to maybe at some point kind of step back and say, okay, that was an interesting theory, but is that really accurate given our empirical data about reality? And this is a great quote, you might have heard this before. Einstein said in the conversation to Heisenberg in, I believe, 1922, it is the theory that determines what can be observed. So again, operationalism is this idea that when you define certain terms of physics, and then you make reality what you have defined and what you can measure, then you forget that you did that, you might run into problems. In the same way that objectivation, in terms of stepping back from reality, pretending you're not there, runs into problems. It's exactly the same idea. And in this case, it is problematic because that assumption that I just mentioned about defining time, defining simultaneity, isn't in fact testable in the framework of relativity theory. This is a paper by two physicists back in the 70s, and they say the key idea of the speed of light being constant, which is another postulate in relativity theory, cannot be tested in the theory. So it's all assumptions. It's about what you choose to put into your theory. Again, it's a theory that determines what can be observed. So Einstein either intentionally or by a happy accident created a theory that is very difficult to test, to falsify, interestingly.
Would you say it's an illusion?
The theory itself? No, I wouldn't. I'd say it's one interpretation.
Well, yeah, he's being explicit about his assumptions. That
But is the reality that people like derive from that, like itself? Can you go back like 2 things?
This one or this one?
The one before, maybe the one before.
Oh,
No, maybe
that one?
One before. I guess I was just interested in this like illusion because it seems like another fuzzy word that people keep referring to, like you said, and it just seems to me to be a phenomena that is only kind of perceived by the mind, you know? So it's like dependent on there being a mind to begin with. And I feel like it's the same thing as trying to objectify like time, you know, as a object, right? Rather than sort of things have a time dimension to them, you know? So I don't know. It seems to me that like you can go backwards in time. You would just be doing so through your mind, you know, like memories and
Imagination.
right,
Yeah,
imagination.
yeah.
And so that imagination, there being an element of freedom in that. So there, I mean, you can think of new futures, right? Or you can reimagine past events, or I don't know. So
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I see where you're going here, and I agree with it entirely in that empirically, objectively, quote unquote, what we know of time is purely the present moment, right? By definition, really.
Yeah.
It's almost trivial, right? Because, you know, there is no, the future is defined as being not now. The past is defined as being not now. So I'm always just now. I remember the past through residue of past moments in my mind, in reality around me. I imagine the future. But to say those past and future moments are in some sense co-equally real as the present, which is what relativity theory leads to, seems to me to be a very strange position, given what we know about our own reality as human beings.
right, I just feel like the future, for instance, would be a direct like result of the present, you know. So it is, in a sense, happening now, right? Like that past.
It's unfolding, right? In each moment,
Yeah. It just seems like you're on like, you know, if you're doing the flow of time, all of that has come to this. So all of the past is right like here, right? And here is where the future like comes from.
Yeah,
It's
I think
crazy.
I think I agree with what you're saying. This keeps on shutting down, I'm not sure why. Okay, so I'm gonna skip that one. My point here is how to reconcile this conventional view of reality in physics today. And it's not just relativity theory. A lot of the theories too that lead to the idea that time is an illusion. It's the main one, but not the only one. With our experience of time, which is very much of being here now and only here now. Again, time is here now. The past is memory. The future is imagination in our experience. We can even look around us at the universe, you know, as far as we can see, into the smallest atom we can look at. There is nothing but the passage of time. There is nothing but the passage of time. Now, you can debate, well, we've got some experiments that show relativity theory is correct. And it's going beyond today's discussion, but in fact, a lot of those experiments are tautological because you cannot falsify that conclusion based on the assumptions of the theory. So it's an interesting debate, it's kind of unfolding now. But maybe we should simply accept that time is fundamentally asymmetrical and then challenge any theory that says, no, it's not. That's kind of an axiomatic position. And Ilya Prigogine, a Belgian-Russian physicist, unfortunate here.
Is there a window that's popping up in the background?
I don't know what's going on. Maybe try shutting down Chrome and see if that
Oh,
happens.
yeah.
I can't even click Chrome. That's weird.
You can't hit the OK on that?
Oh, is it? And it's looks like it's creating two different screens.
Yeah, let me just force click Chrome. See if that helps. Okay. So Prigogine worked in a field called non-equilibrium thermodynamics. And this is basically, in one word, answer, entropy. And his view, after working for 50-some years, winning a Nobel Prize, was that this tendency in mainstream physics to spatialize time is incompatible with both the evolving universe which we live in, which we observe around us, and our own human experience. We need to reformulate the laws of physics in accordance with the open, evolving universe in which man lives. And he had his own agenda, but he's coming at this very much from the point of view of a scientist and a philosopher. And I agree entirely. So my point here is that it's not just, little old me saying this needs to change. There's some pretty big thinkers out there who are saying this needs to change. And in fact, there are other theories out there. So I'm not just saying reject Einstein relativity. What do you do? Well, there's a bunch of other theories out there that explain the same data in different ways. And Lorentz, Hendrik Lorentz, was a Dutch physicist who was actually a mentor to Einstein. And the equations he developed were in fact adopted by Einstein in his own theory. And Lorentz's theory came along a few years before Einstein. And it explains the same data using the same theories, but a different interpretation that does not lead to the conclusion that time is evolution. You also have various neo-Lorentzian approaches nowadays that you can look to as alternatives. So anyway, one example of how deep science might be used. Now I'm going to wrap up here with some thoughts on empiricism more generally. And it's been interesting to me looking at these different fields in physics and biology and psychology, et cetera, that even though empiricism and being data-driven is given a lot of lip service, I find time and time again that a more kind of, it's called rationalism, is kind of the approach adopted where mathematical theories and certain assumptions are allowed to get way ahead of our direct experience. Mm-hmm. And we hear all the time, wow, what do you think you know of reality is an illusion? And of course, a lot of things are, in need of revision, because we are, of course, very much in an evolutionary bubble, so to speak, that is being expanded by modern science. But the pendulum swung too far, in my view. We need to kind of come back a bit to earth in a very real way. So there are kind of two forms of empiricism that I see around me. And actually, Matt and I talked a bit about this. We have what I call conventional empiricism, which is what I just described, where, yeah, we give lip service to data and being empirically driven. But if a theory seems interesting and tells us what we think is real based on our own data and our own experience, well then, we're an illusion. Or you can return to a more kind of primary empiricism, which takes our senses and that data as primary, but recognizing that sometimes we need to accept what you think of as being, reality isn't the whole picture. And let me illustrate that. So, a really good example. Is the Earth flat or is it a sphere? To our senses, immediately, it seems pretty darn flat, But you could actually deduce, and people did, before we had, airplanes and space flight, that the world was in fact a sphere. A lot of ways you can deduce that, based on traveling, shadows, etc. But just in general, the technique is to zoom out, right? If you're looking at something as a phenomenon, you're trying to figure out, well, how is it? What are the contours of that phenomenon? Well, you zoom out and zoom in, either metaphorically or literally. So on our planet, you could zoom out and see, hey, this is actually a disk, but this is not really what reality is for us. We actually live in a sphere. So in that case, our experience of reality is an illusion. But again, you know, if you're being discerning, even as a caveman, you probably could figure out it's not actually a flat surface. It's probably some kind of, you know, curved thing we're living on. But with time, you can zoom in and out as much as you want, and you never see anything but the passage of time. There is no other reality than the passage of time. And it's only through these mathematical devices and strained interpretations to get us to the idea that time is an illusion. So deep science should be fundamentally empirical. And I've already mentioned, you know, one way to actually reconcile the idea of today's physics with our experience of time is to simply say, look, axiomatically, time is passing. Anything you tell me that contradicts that, I'm going to say, nah, you're probably wrong. And more generally, we need to return to accepting that our direct experience is data. You know, we are conducting experiments, quote unquote, all the time, just by our being alive and being awake. And the approach I'm talking about is already kind of formalized in various ways for 100 years now in what's called process philosophy. And this is Alfred North Whitehead. And he is probably the most prominent process philosopher in the modern era. But he has many compatriots, you know, going back to Heraclitus and ancient Greece, and Plato and Aristotle, Plotinus, Bergson, William James, etc. And the basic point, as the name suggests, is that all things are changing. There is always a process. Reality is a process. And part of that process is by, you know, various chains of reasoning that process has both mind and matter elements to it. Two sides of the same coin, essentially. Those are kind of the 2 points of Whitehead's panpsychism in a really quick summary. And these ideas have actually been expanded into many different fields. And so process science more generally, which is not a phrase, I actually Googled it, it's not really a phrase out there. So we're in that. But there are many books and papers right now. There's the Center of Process Studies. There's a lot of work done in this field of Whiteheadian process philosophy. I wanted to just highlight a few. Got a book called Process Physics by Reg Cahill in Australia. He's doing some interesting work. This book, Back to Darwin, is a set of essays looking at evolutionary theory through kind of a process perspective. David Bohm, well-known physicist, wrote a few books that were explicitly indebted to Whitehead, including Wholeness and Equal Order. And David Ray Griffin, well, this is more philosophy than science, I'm mentioning here because it's really an excellent book on the mind-body problem. I read this book back in probably 2007, and it really got me going down this road because it was so compelling. Highly recommend it.
Have you read The Long Trajectory?
Mm-hmm.
Matt, have you? Eric Weiss? I read, so I guess Eric is one of the teachers here, but he wrote a book, and it reminded me a lot of the David Ray Griffin book, just because he's combining Sri Aurobindo, I believe, with Whitehead, and I mean, I think it would go along with the panpsychist.
The Long Trajectory, huh?
Yeah,
Okay.
and
Check it out.
experientialist.
Mm-hmm. Is that the guy in our track?
He's going to be at the conference, but in a different track.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think what he was saying was, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this, but the idea that mind basically incarnates as the universe, essentially, and it is that unfolding that occurs, and it has a time dimension, I'm guessing. I don't know.
That's actually very Whiteheadian, yeah. He calls it the creative advance, and reality is a creative advance into novelty. And that's a sum total of every entity, from the electron up to planets and stars, of their own decisions about how to manifest in the next moment. It's a creative co-process. So it's really kind of beautifully democratic process and worldview, and it sounds like it's pretty constant with
Yeah.
this book.
I guess the question then would be like, you know, if we are each a unity of experience, right, then what is the unity that we all are making up? Is there a unity, right, that is sort of greater than us, and
Yeah, those are big questions.
that entity's moment?
Yeah, universal
Yeah.
moment of thought, yeah, different lecture.
Totally.
So my last point on process science here is to highlight in the field of biology. I'm actually trained originally in evolutionary theory, and I've done some writing in the philosophy of biology in this area, where I've been trying to re-inject mind into that discussion. And this little cartoon is the first in the series I'm doing. I didn't design it, but I commissioned someone to do it, called Animal Einsteins. And the point is to highlight the role of mind in the evolution of animals that we know of. And I've done some research on beaver dams, and no one knows how they evolved. Because the point is that a dam, to be functional, has to be complete. If it's not, it doesn't do a darn thing, right? So that beaver has to figure out, or get really lucky, you know, how to create a fully functional dam. My money is on a really smart beaver Einstein, creating a dam, you know? So it's not like, oh, let's make a dam randomly, you know? Like, there had to be some thought going on there. And animals are not stupid. You see a lot of things they do that they clearly are, there's some mental activity going on there. So I think it's a bootstrapping process of ongoing intelligence and solutions that actually is a force in evolution. So I'm going to do a series of these, highlighting different ones. The next one is Peckerstein, figures out how to store acorns in a tree. Stay tuned.
How many do you have, like?
I got
so
about
far?
10 right now, like, you know, planning, but who knows, there might be hundreds in
Yeah.
the future. So summing up, my last slide here, and this is just kind of a quick summary. So, you know, the first main idea is that today's science is an absent-minded science because it has intentionally or through oversight ignored the role of mind in nature. We need to extend it now into a new deep science by acknowledging mind explicitly, recognizing a single field of experience for all of us, and that allows us to use a unified set of tools to examine that reality as a scientist. And looking at time in relation to consciousness and our knowledge of the world more generally, we need to get away from this idea of time being an illusion. And then last, we can and should develop a process science as an equivalent of a deep science. They're kind of the same thing, really. But process science is kind of just a more established school of thought in various areas. So that's it. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Tim.
Any last questions?
Can you go back to
Which one?
the? Yeah, no, that's good. Just, I've got tons of questions, but I don't. Can you guys ask questions first?
So you won't
I
feel
won't
guilty.
stop. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about the unity of consciousness is something you referred to several times, and then also the unity of nature. It's kind of it's an a priori assumption that makes science possible. That nature itself is unified in some sense, and that when we do an experiment in Paris to measure the force of gravity or what have you, that it will the same force will be measured in Detroit, and that so gravity is universal in that sense. And that when we measure the speed of light in one place, it's going to be the same in another place. But even if, I mean, and first of all, when we have done these things, there are these minute differences in these forces, and there's renormalization and operational definitions of what they are in order to allow for that basic assumption of the unity of nature to hold true. But I just wonder to what extent, when we're talking about cosmology and metaphysics, like, do we need to question that assumption about the unity of nature? What if nature is a plurality? What if there's various pockets of, different forms of organization that lead to different forces playing themselves out in different places.
You want to address that?
Well, in psychology, replicate is going on right now. We've had a lot of problems with replicating basic psychology findings. And Schooler, our colleague, has got this whole replication initiative going on all over the world.
Right.
And
yeah, it's so much more obvious in psychology because the human mind is so interactive. And
yeah, so there was a great article in the New Yorker called "The Truth Wears Off."
Oh yeah.
And, you do it once or twice, and every time after that, it's a little less.
Right.
So what accounts for this is our methods, is the statistics that we use to test our claims. Are we moving targets? What?
Right.
I mean, if
Yeah.
there's anything, we have this amazing feeling that the universe is
Right.
a constant except for the things that we know.
There's two dimensions of this, right? There's the notion of spatial unity or uniform, the laws are uniform across all of space, and then there's the temporal dimension. Are these laws changing over time?
Yeah.
And when you start to ask these questions, the idea of scientific knowledge becomes way more, it's on shakier ground. And we can still pursue, obviously science is effective in operational, instrumental terms, and we can produce amazing technologies based on the equations that are predicting the behavior of some of the particles and whatnot. But who's to say that in 100 years those quantum equations won't work as well as they do now?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and there is some work being done on these issues for sure, in the decline effect, space, and even some data suggesting, for example, the speed of light has changed over time. My view is that all things are changing, including laws. But of course, laws are human creations. They're just our best approximations of what we see reality doing. There's nothing a priori about those laws. We make them up, And the idea of things changing over time, to me, certainly matches my experience of things around me normally always changing. So why wouldn't reality itself, as an ongoing process, always be changing too? That said, the best data for regularities in nature is our own experience of regularities in nature. We wake up in the morning, we don't float upwards, we stay in bed, and we can make iPhones, and they work pretty darn well throughout our whole lives, So I'd say there is certainly a pretty regular experience of regularity that science is looking at, but that may change over time. And it might be really large, some spans of time in which they change, who knows?
The thing I never heard about during your whole talk was something that's growing in influence right now. It's been around for a long time. The many worlds interpretation. Hugh Everett's.
I didn't talk about it because I don't like it very much.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, it is an example of the de-minding of nature. The reason it's done is to avoid Copenhagen and that crazy interpretation. And instead they say, here's this other crazy interpretation. What can happen, does happen in every moment. So there's an infinite number of universes in each moment. And to me, that's like pretty profligate as
So
an
much for
explanation.
parsimony, right?
Yeah, exactly. Whatever can happen does happen. Well, that's great, but that's not an explanation,
Right.
Now, the thing I kept thinking about was Edwin Abbott's book, Flatland, and you actually put flat Earth up there. And, we have really limited sense organs in our eyes and ears. There's so much stuff that we just can't perceive directly. Infrared light, there are animals that aren't nearly as smart as us that can do that no problem. Put a mouse somewhere and tell it to walk in a bearing of 17 degrees, and it's like no problem. Maybe we just can't perceive these things.
It's always a possibility, but I'd say things like many worlds. I wouldn't say that's a sensory issue. I would say, because even if they are real, we can't perceive them. Literally we can't, because they're in different realms, But the whole idea of different realms as being explanatory is itself strangely anti-empirical, right?
Sure.
If you can't go there and test it, then how is it explanatory?
Right. But our limitations, our own thoughts and models of the world spring from our observations, and we know that we're limited in what we can observe. So, I don't know, it seems like our mind is kind of a limited tool.
It certainly is, yeah, and explanations are always about the best thing we can do to understand, meaning make some sense of as a narrative, given phenomena. And in the space of quantum mechanics, you've got Bohmian interpretation, the Bohmian interpretation, which is similar to what I mentioned before about self-collapse. And it is taken seriously, but it's not the majority view. And it relies on there being kind of a field of potential that pervades reality, and then each particle riding like a little boat on that field of potential. So each entity is both wave and particle at the same time. Not like this perspective is this, that's what reality is. It's both at the same time. And it is empirically adequate, meaning it can explain the same phenomena that Copenhagen and many worlds can. And it makes sense rationally. And so I have not delved as deep as I need to make strong conclusions in that space. But from what I've read so far, the Bohmian interpretation seems to me to make a lot more sense than competitors.
Well, there's a whole list of those things.
Yeah.
But, you know, Edwin Abbott, he just made his Linelanders and Flatlanders seem like such fools to the reader.
Yeah.
Because they were just so arrogant in their conclusions that they, you know, they made these theories based on their perceptual inputs. And, you know, here we are, just one up from them. You know, having the Linelander laugh at the Pointlander and the Flatlander laugh at the Linelander. I'm laughing at all of them. You know, 4D block universe is slapping his knee over me.
Well, there's actually a great quote by Whitehead, I should have included here at the end, is that, you know, ultimately we need to be really humble about our knowledge and understanding, because we don't know a darn thing. You know, again, we are given all this, and one thing that actually gives me kind of hope for being engaged and interested throughout my whole life is that we'll never figure out, you know, even the surface of what reality is. And that's kind of cool. There's always new science to be done. But we always need to keep in mind that what you think you know for sure might not be at all accurate. So again, even though I say these are things I really, really know, even those I might change my mind about at some point. You had?
I'll just ask, because I'm curious, seeing a lot of what you were doing off and on reminded me of a book I read a few years ago now by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary. He's a neuroscientist in London. Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
It's kind of the latest on split brain studies. But he's updated it in a really interesting philosophical way, and went way back and incorporated anthropology and some of his very provocative theories, I think, about human evolution. And his main point what seemed to be that there've been these kind of phases, for lack of a better word coming to my mind, where left brain and right brain functions have predominated. Earlier, the right brain, which he revamps from the early 80s, you know, stuff that was pretty simplified, really, and got a bad rep for it. But the latest studies are much more complex, and a lot of now what is incorporated in the idea of the right brain, which supposedly, according to his theory, is the older master, the original master of the brain. The master and his emissary comes from Nietzsche. It's an allegory. Anyway, so his call in the end is for something similar to what you're talking about, bottom line. Again, that there seems to, we've gone through this space probably since, you know, scientific revolution, that where left brain functions have predominated in general, just culturally, especially in the West, of course, and he's calling for us to reintegrate the whole brain function, the empirical stuff being more of a right brain.
I'll check it out. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's really very interesting.
Yeah, I read some of Gazanich's work on split brain patients, and he was one who kind of, I think, pioneered that field.
Yeah.
With Sperry, I believe it was. But it sounds, I mean, it's a really interesting area. It's kind of counterintuitive, but one thing I got from Gazanich's work is that the two hemispheres when they're separated, which was actually done as a treatment for with epilepsy for a while, resulted in almost two personalities in the same head coexisting, where you'd ask, a person what they're looking at, and then ask a person what they're holding under the table where they can't see it, and you get two different answers. So it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
But actually, it supports in a way this panpsychist view of mind being a nested hierarchy of minds upon minds upon minds. And so in our normal brain, we have one general dominant mind, but we certainly could not, my feeling is we probably have many smaller minds in that same brain. And when we dream, those often manifest in different ways.
Anyway, I think it's kind of a fascinating time we're in now, where there is this integration now happening, at least I see it, of many different of the reductionist kind of departmentalized, sub-departmentalized specialties. We're starting to pull it back out, and I think that's so important. I mean, philosophy needs to be integrated with neuroscience, with evolutionary biology and physics and all of that. And anyway, thank you for your efforts to help with that.
This is an interesting point about split brains, and the other side of this questioning the unity of nature is questioning the unity of mind. And one of the people that do take panpsychism seriously will say, okay, well, how do you get from smaller minds to bigger minds?
Yeah,
it's the combination problem. And I think a lot of the force of that problem is a result of sort of overplaying the extent to which our consciousness is unified. Because, I don't know about you, but there are many me's that are always vying for my attention at any given moment. And my field of experience, just as you depicted it with those circles, there are these different focal points. And they're sometimes more or less overlapping, but sometimes they're kind of disparate. And there's a continuity to the field of experience. When we've observed that flow over the course of a lifetime, we start to feel a general sense of connection between the various nodes in our experience. But I don't think that we can take that continuity for granted as something that's necessary. It's like maybe psychological health is characterized by a more or less continuous sense of self. But that sense of continuity breaks down for many people.
Either a genius or a shaman or a madman, right?
Right. So I think to the extent that nature or the mind is unified, it's always a constructed form of unity that needs to be continually achieved, and it's not something that's just there given. This is part of what I think a process ontology is getting at. That even for Whitehead, the continuity of time, the flow of time, is constructed in the process of like each actual occasion pulsating and inheriting the objective immortality of the past.
That is time, right?
It's a discontinuous process, actually.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting area of research. I want to delve into more in Whitehead's thought, because my intuition is that there is maybe reality is kind of a three-dimensional screen, where rather than pixels we have voxels, and each voxel manifests in each moment based on the rules of the prior moments, but these are conscious moments in each voxel or set of voxels, etc. If that's the case, then it supports the idea of a more regular pulsation of time, maybe a Planck moment, as the shortest duration, which then compounds over many levels of reality. But at the same time, Whitehead says, no, it's really not that specific. It's actually much less definite. And he even talks about time in the process of concrescence, where actually that is a timeless process. And to me, that is problematic, but maybe I don't know enough about it to really grok at this point. But time is just really tricky no matter what area of thought you're looking at. It's a really, it's an interesting conundrum.
Oh, just
I think we have
quick,
how much
that's a
time?
TED Talk if you want to look into it more in a
McGilchrist
brief
does it?
summary. McGilchrist, yeah.
Oh, really?
It's
Okay.
a TED Talk.
McGilchrist.
Ian
Yeah.
McGilchrist.
Okay, check it out. I guess we have 10 minutes of time for a few more questions.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of timelessness. I think that's a really interesting thing. I really liked your presentation.
Thank you.
It was great. In fact, it was so great. I felt like there wasn't, like, I didn't think there was a problem. You know, there's no like that hard problem seems not so hard when you're talking about deep science. You know?
Yeah.
Mission accomplished.
Yes, right. And although I'm kind of I feel like you don't like illusion, you know. I feel like
I
you're
like
really
reality.
like against illusions, you know. And I feel like to some extent, like that's all we have are our illusions, you know, and like all of these interpretations are then sort of systematized in these theories that like people will sort of reference and cite as they sort of justify their actions, you know? And so whether it's like, you know, a theory of race or a theory of politics or a theory of whatever, people end up sort of living in these own realities that they've created that are guided by, I mean, essentially these illusions, you know? And so, you know, hopefully the trick is to get those illusions in dialogue with each other, so they're kind of building into a meta illusion or whatever. But I don't know. So I think you're a little hard on the other.
The illusion part, okay.
Yeah.
Well, there are levels and there are levels, right? And so I fully recognize that words are illusory in a manner, you know, they're pointers to reality. We're trying to, though, with science and good philosophy, establish some kind of base that we can feel is somewhat reliable. And it's always going to be changing. So again, if you're scientific, you recognize changes, you know, an ongoing process. So I'm not trying to establish any kind of like, you know, these are written in stone laws forever and ever. But I'd like to just personally feel somewhat confident in my basic worldview as a foundation. And I think if you're looking at science as a way to uncover new tools and new forces of nature, new technologies, the more accurate, you know, in terms of asymptotic truth, your theories are, then the better you're going to be at discovering new things. And that's actually the test of, I think, a meta-scientific worldview is how good are you at solving new problems and finding new things. When you hit the end of the road, then you have to reassess, you know, what you're doing. And I wouldn't say we're there yet in science, but you look at, I don't know what you read in physics, but everything I read in physics nowadays talks about there's really successful theories, but this one interesting problem over here that really seems to defy solution. And my feeling is the nature of time and consciousness is that key to all the things kind of falling into place into a much larger, more comprehensive worldview.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree. And I certainly think science will have to, like, I mean, it will have to be compatible with scientific, you know, method. And but I would ask, like, do you feel like there are? I mean, clearly, I guess you just said there are limits to science, you know. Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of quotes by Wilbur and Whitehead. Basically, the map is not the territory, and it's like a fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
For sure,
You know?
yeah.
So we were sort of, I don't know, I feel like there is a, to a large extent, a sort of fetishizing of science that happens to some degree, where people sort of very much only use science as a way of knowing. And I think at one point you were talking about like other ways of knowing that are sort of happening in an experiential way. Could you go like one of your early slides for a second? I think it was maybe like the first one or something.
Way back when?
Yeah, way back when. By the way, I'm very much looking forward to seeing the rest of the
Animal Einstein.
Animal Einstein.
All right. Slow here. I'm almost at the beginning here. Which one are you looking for?
It was basically the one where it was like sheer magic,
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah, this one.
Well, and so that's what I was wondering, like, I feel like this is a theory, or this is an observation or interpretation of a real set of data, and that's the like most sophisticated like conclusion he has come up with, you know? And so it seems like that magic is sort of on the level of the woo, you know? But it
That's his
really
point,
needs
sure, yeah.
to be like studied like in depth, you know?
No, he's trying to make fun of people that would say that mind can come from
For no
mindless matter.
Yeah.
But there are definitely philosophers who argue very seriously that, you know, the fact that life emerged or that mind emerged there is no explanation. It was a completely spontaneous event. You know, there's this French guy, Quentin Meillassoux, I don't know if you've heard of him, somewhat well-known in continental philosophy, who makes this argument that, you know, there is no reason that life emerged out of matter. Matter was just random processes, and somehow it became life. And we just happen to be in that universe where that...
But it's not an explanation of anything.
He will admit that it's not an explanation.
Glosses over the explanation.
What if it's...
Maybe if you said that's all you can say about it.
He's just saying it is the
That's
case,
what happened,
and he's accepting Hume's critique of causality, that we don't actually know what causality is. We don't have any... So he's throwing out explanation on philosophical grounds.
What do you do in philosophy?
Proving that you can't explain it.
Can't explain it. The anti-philosopher.
Yeah. You know, so people argue this seriously.
Yeah.
No, and I get that. I just feel like magic is like, I mean, it seems like it's a question, you know, and we're explaining it through these books that you referenced, I don't know, and it's you know, these theories that we're creating and using language to sort of build this sort of way of knowing or understanding or representing what we know to ourselves or whatnot. And that's great, and that's like really helpful because it then allows us to sort of reconsider this guy that doesn't believe in awareness would be really angry at this, but I feel like it sort of allows us to be aware of our realities and the way we sort of have our societies. And I was interested, like, as a lawyer and kind of, you know, regarding like the law and legality and like all the fucked up shit that's happening in the world. It seems like I don't know. It's all built on this theory, you know, that is extremely shallow.
Meaning modern science?
Yeah, I mean modern science, and I guess the modern worldview, and like competing nations, and you know, a certain fundamental premises that people are living by, and they're all based on this, you know, illusion or this, you know, just the evolution of the assumption that we are sort of competing for life, you know? And I don't know, David Ray Griffin, he's a 9/11 is an inside job, right? So, and that's extremely controversial, right? Just like climate changes, and it seems like people are living in these different realities, and I don't know, it's kind of, you wonder how to operationalize, I guess, this deep science in an institution.
I think I see what you're kind of getting at, and Matt's giving a talk at our big conference in June on cosmopolitical pluralism. Is that a fair phrase? The idea of pluralism is one that William James, I think, pioneered, where it's not about developing this monistic theory of this is the theory of everything. It's really about recognizing the reality itself is pluralistic, and you make your own tools the best you can. I recognize that endeavor, and I think maybe it's an aesthetic preference, where you have kind of lumpers and splitters, you know, gooey types and pokey types, was talked about. I'm more of a gooey guy, but yeah, I like things to unify, and like, you know, the grand theory that unifies all things, you know. But I recognize entirely that, you know, because practically, as human beings, and certainly in different cultures, different times, we are inevitably pluralistic, right? And so being progressive today, quote unquote, means that you recognize that pluralism. So politically, certainly it manifests in a way of, you know, respect for other people's points of view and not trying to, you know, colonize them conceptually to make them believe what you believe. But at the same time, there is a worthwhile discussion to be had about all ideas, not just science, but political ideas too, about how do we achieve a world that is more productive for all of us on a limited planet. You know, so that's, again, beyond today's talk, but certainly part of the same discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Read Russell Brand's book, Revolution.
Yeah.
It's actually quite good.
Okay. Cool.
Anything else, or should we wrap it there?
Could you say again when and the title of this conference
Oh,
in Claremont?
it's the 10th International Whitehead Conference, but the title of this particular one is called Seizing an Alternative Towards an Ecological Civilization.
Okay, and it's at the Claremont Colleges?
It's Pomona
It's a
College
big
is
deal.
hosting it.
It's
I grew up
huge.
there.
So like 82 different tracks going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's gonna be huge.
There is one track of 82.
Wow.
It's gonna be.
I can get it from you later. I can remember it.
You can what?
I'll get it from you later.
Oh yeah, just
So
Google.
this is all
if
in
you
your
just
book,
Google
by the way?
Whitehead 2015.
No, my book
Okay.
It'll be the first
is about the first
link
part,
that comes up.
absent-minded science. And there's also a lot of interviews in there too, so it's kind of it's a collection of essays, but the first 10 essays are called absent-minded science.
Mhm.
So it sets forth the case for why today's science is inadequate given the mind-body problem. My new book now I'm working on is about deep science. So a lot of this is kind of a work in progress.
Cool.
So probably in a year I'll have that book done. Cool, thank you.
Thanks, Tam.
Thank you very much.